Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you from all over the world. Today, I am very pleased and honored to be joined by my colleague, Professor Thomas Kochan. Tom is really a highly respected, not only researcher, but practitioner in the field of workforce and the economy. His research and his applied work have really contributed to completely different and more effective ways of bringing workforces, employers, and policymakers together. Start perhaps by telling us a little bit about some of the work you've been very involved with in MIT, which before we'd even heard of COVID-19 was grappling with the question of what are the implications of technology and new technology on work and the future of work. As background, what that work was, and first of all, where will we before?
Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you for the nice introduction, and this is really an important conversation. As you indicated, MIT set up at the request of the president and the provost a MIT-wide task force on work of the future about 3 years ago. And we have been looking with robotics experts, AI experts, economists, management leaders, political scientists, a cross-section of us have been asking, how can we use technology to shape a better future of work for everyone? And so that has been the focus of this work, not to wait for technology to tell us how many jobs are going away and so on, but to say, how can we augment how people work to make it more fulfilling, a more broadly shared prosperity, and to make sure that we are dealing effectively and equitably with people who are displaced from work. So that's, I think, a major issue of our time. We have taken a very proactive approach to this by saying we can address some of the injustices, inequalities, lack of productivity growth through technology if we use it wisely and if we integrate the technology advances with the way in which people work, and we use it to change how we work rather than just to think about how we displace people. That work continues, it's very important, but then, as you said, along comes this shock of COVID, and then Black Lives Matter and other crises that have focused our attention. And if anything, what this does is to elevate and accelerate the pace of change. We are seeing enormous adjustments to using technology to address some elements of the crisis. And let me just give you one example in some research that we have been doing. We have studied this giant healthcare organization called Kaiser Permanente, which is one of our leading healthcare organizations in the United States. And we've been looking at how they are adapting in new clinics using new technology and kiosks and laptops in new ways and new ways of integrating the care that they are providing with people in their homes and all kinds of technological changes. And it's been quite successful, but then along comes COVID, and all of a sudden they have to shift to telemedicine. And it was the fact that they were already using these advanced technologies that allowed them to move from about 30% telemedicine now to about 95% during the crisis. So 95% of the patients are now being served with advanced technology and with workers who have been trained on these technologies and who are skilled on it and who are working together in a team. That's the way in which we can grasp the future of work and change it as it comes along, take advantage of technologies, and people can serve patients, their customers, better, and the workforce is fully engaged because they've been well trained. That's what we're trying to do here at MIT, and there are other examples of that, but that's maybe just to get us started.
You mentioned there, thanks, Tom, in your opening to those comments, also the more recent phenomenon of Black Lives Matter and the focus that that has been putting on questions of diversity and inclusion. And there's obviously some very specific meanings of that. But as you look at this question of the impacts, not only of the technological wave that we were already experiencing, but now the overlay of COVID and the overlay of these more focus on diversity, inclusion, issues of equity, is anything really shifting for us that you're really concerned about? Are there any opportunities that you're seeing that we can really grasp to make a difference?
I think like the COVID crisis, the Black Lives Matter, and all of the raising up of concerns around racial justice create wonderful opportunities for organizations to accelerate and strengthen their commitments to diversity. Most organizations, companies all around the world have strengthened their diversity initiatives over the last decade by elevating an executive to be maybe the chief diversity officer and maybe even report to the CEO. And these professionals have had a very positive effect, but many of them have bumped up against a ceiling of influence. And they have found, much to their frustration, that while the CEO may have good intentions, there's resistance in the organization, and they can't get the kinds of things, the kinds of changes that they feel are essential for racial justice and justice to all elements of diversity in the organization. Now they're getting impetus from below. They're getting the power and the pressure of protest. They're getting the workforce putting demands, as the Google workers have, for stronger rules on diversity, but more voice for them, more voice even at the level of corporate governance. And we're seeing this happen all over the world. And so now all of a sudden, if we engage people from the workplace up, we can really fundamentally make changes in organizations and overcome some of the resistance that you sometimes experience in middle management or from peer to peer in organizations. But it's the power of the voices coming from below saying, enough is enough. Let's rid ourselves of any residual forms of racism in our organizations and listen to us, because we know how to do it. We know what we experience. And so the organizations that are most successful now are opening up new channels of influence, more use of affinity groups, more use of groups that representatives sitting with senior management and sitting on boards of directors, or at least meeting with the boards of directors to say, how are we going to evaluate? How are we going to move forward? How are we going to elevate this to a new level? But it requires listening, and it requires mobilizing at the grassroots level, and then utilizing the power of that mobilization in a very positive way in organizations. So I think we're in a new era of managing for diversity, but it's managing with distributed leadership like we teach at Sloan all the way through the organization.
Great, that's very interesting. And Tom, you know, in your work for many years, you have really excelled at building trust between business leadership, labor organizations, policymakers. It seems like what you're advocating for here is, you know, a real trust between those stakeholders that perhaps we haven't really always seen. I think that's probably not a controversial statement. So what are some of the things that you think we could be doing that perhaps we're not doing enough of to actually enable business leaders to, you know, feel as empowered to trust and let go as you're asking them to empower, recommending that we empower, you know, our whole organizations to act?
Well, the first thing is that business leaders need to recognize, as so many of them already do, that they cannot do it alone. The days of having strong values and a culture from the top, those are necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient. And so they have to open up to listening and engaging and working cooperatively with groups of employees and diverse groups where they are unionized, making sure that the representatives are part of this process, or if it's a works council in Europe and other parts of the world where those exist, or even representation on corporate boards of directors. We have to make sure that we build an inclusive process that all of these different stakeholders can participate in decision making and discussion, and so that their voices can be heard. And you see this both in the racial justice, but you also see it in the COVID situation, where now organizations are doing their very best to create safe conditions for people to come back to work. But we have seen examples where even well-run companies, and I'll give you another example, Epic Systems, which is one of the leading developers of electronic medical records, happens to be located in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a very progressive company with a very committed CEO. And she said, look, we're going to bring everyone back to work starting in September, because they had obviously been working at home. And they had all the safety precautions and all the communication from the top saying, here's how we're going to do it. And they got a revolt from their employees. These are professional IT people, all committed to the work. And they said, look, some of us have family situations. Some of our kids aren't going to be in school yet. Some of us have maybe some health conditions that worry us. And then we still don't know how this is going to work out. And we want to be part of the process. And so she backed off. Now they are talking with each other about how do you build the trust? How do you engage the employees in a common shared objective of coming back to work safely and respecting the needs for those who may have some conditions that don't allow them to come back? And how do we then work as a team to get our work done and to keep people safe? That's the kind of inclusiveness on racial, on professional, on organizational levels, all of those dimensions. People all have to have a voice, and they have to have a voice that is respected, but then they also have to be held accountable for making proposals and for committing to working together. I see this happening in lots of organizations, and in fact, Peter, I think we are doing this at MIT very well. I hats off to our president, our provost, to our dean's office in the Sloan School. All of the work to try to figure out how to start our semester and how to take care of everyone and how to take care of our students and meet our responsibilities and our mission in creative ways. Lots of involvement, enormous conversations and input and faculty volunteering to help. That's the way in which we can bring our stakeholders together and really, really turn a new chapter, open a new chapter in how we manage and how we lead organizations.
Some interesting examples that you talk about there. I wonder whether one of the things that many of those good examples have in common is that the kinds of work that their people do have been amenable to these sort of technological methods of making safe ways of working, oftentimes remotely, or even if we're just redesigning how work happens in physical settings. But aren't there many other people, roles, functions, jobs, companies, whole organizations for whom that's an altogether different kind of challenge? And what kind of divisions are we risking, and what kinds of solutions do you see to help us avoid those divisions?
That's a very, very important point, Peter. And I'll give you another example from my own experience. Just as the COVID crisis was beginning to come to the United States, as you know, I do mediation of labor disputes from time to time, and I got asked to help or to mediate a very, very difficult healthcare labor dispute in Seattle, Washington, with their largest nonprofit healthcare organization and their nurses and what they call environmental service. That is the cleaners, the dietitians, the people who make the food, who deliver. So you have very low wage workers, mostly women, mostly immigrants, Latinas, and African Americans, and some Asians. Very diverse group. And it was a very difficult and bad history of labor relations. And it was happening just as the COVID crisis hit Seattle. So here we are trying to resolve a labor dispute. And the governor asked me to come in and said, don't just resolve this dispute, but help them turn their relationship around. And over the course of a week, and then some follow-up work, we created a labor management partnership where they said, we now have a new crisis that we've got to work on together. And we're going to have a commitment to diversity and inclusion and respect for everyone who works, whether they're cleaning the rooms and doing the important work of infection control, or the nurses, or the physicians, or the managers. And so it was wonderful to see how we could use that crisis to say, I guess we are all in this together. And we may have some different points of view on a whole bunch of issues, and we're going to resolve those, and we did resolve those, but we're also going to set up a partnership process so that we can be a model for how the state of Washington can deal with this. And the governor then used the agreement there and the new relationship to build a healthcare council, bringing labor representatives and industry representatives and the workforce itself to redeploy people into organizations as needed. That's diversity, that's labor management relations, that's partnership, and that's mutual respect at its best. And so many of those low-wage workers had to be housed near the hospitals because they couldn't afford to live near the hospital, but they had to find homes or places for them to be there so they could come in. Many of them had to have backup childcare, and they arranged for that. The whole range of innovation that came for these essential workers who in the past maybe hadn't been adequately respected. And for me, it was one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had in my professional career.
That's a very uplifting example. As I think about that and just looking at some of the questions as well, isn't it still though the case that there are whole sections of the economy that are just not going to come back the way they were, and that's true the world over. This is not just an American or European challenge. And so, what's that mean for the social compact between people and society?
Yeah.
Presumably, we're going to have an enormous task to get people to a place where they can become capable of doing different economic work. So that they can support themselves and their families. And that seems like, to many of us, an overwhelming challenge. How can we address this?
The sad reality is that if we don't address it with very proactive strategies, we are going to end up with worse inequality and inequity in society, and a bigger, deeper divide between the high-income people who can manage technology and work from home partly and so on, and low-wage workers. A good number of these jobs are not coming back in hospitality, in restaurants, and hotels, and travel, and so on. Yes, 5 years from now, these jobs in some form may come back, but they're not coming back in the short run or in the intermediate run, which means people are going to have to redeploy to something else. And we have to be active at all levels of our economy in whatever country we're in to help people redeploy to new occupations. That's going to require some sustained income support for people at the bottom, because these changes and these new deployments aren't going to come quickly. That's going to require much, much more investment in workforce development and training, because they've now even lost whatever training the employer might provide because the employer isn't there. And so we have to step up at the community level and at the sector level, at the industry level, to say, how are the jobs changing? How can we redeploy people to new opportunities? How can we make sure that we provide the training and the family supports during this training period? So in the United States, we have a much longer way to go than in Europe, because we've had such a weak safety net for low-income people. We didn't have paid family leave. We have it as an emergency now. It's got to be made permanent. We didn't have paid sick leave for people at the bottom, unless companies provided it on their own. That also is there on an emergency basis and has to stay. We had to expand our unemployment insurance system to cover many of the people who were not otherwise covered, and that's going to continue. So every country has to find its own way to support, both income-wise, family-wise, and training and job development for these lower income people whose jobs are either going to change fundamentally or are not going to come back. And many of the ones that are going to change are being changed by the first point we discussed, by new technology. Companies around the world are investing more and more now in technology to try to be more resilient in the next crisis. And so the way in which work is going to be done is changing, and we have to make sure that our government resources work with private industry, work with labor organizations, to make sure that we provide the workforce the supports that they can redeploy to wherever the jobs are going to be in the future. Much bigger job than we've had in the past. We had a terrible, deep, Great Recession, as we called it, in 2007, 2009. It took us a decade to get those jobs back. If we don't act very, very proactively now, it's going to take another decade, and many people don't have the resiliency to survive in the same way from a second blow to their income, to their family situation, and to their long-term security.
Interesting. So in the situation that you're describing, there's this need for this investment and the need for this planning. You also mentioned that many companies are taking not only this necessity but also this opportunity to change their operations and to make investments in technology at a much faster pace than might have been the case in the past. We like to almost joke that in academia we did in 2 weeks what was going to take 20 years in terms of moving to more digital modes of working, for example. But that still seems to be a very business-driven motivation for those organizations and organizational leaders that can do that. And yet a lot of what you're describing here sounds to me like much more of a societal kind of need. Are you seeing a shift in how leaders throughout business actually think differently about their societal responsibilities, or is that something where there's still a lot of work to do? Because frankly, I think many of us, if we look at how we see some businesses acting even now, might question whether there's really a fundamental change happening of the sort that you're talking about.
Yeah, I was so delighted to see the Business Roundtable in 2019 make a statement that they have to shift from just primarily focusing on shareholder value to addressing certainly the interests of investors and shareholders and employees and their communities in a more balanced way. Well, now's the time where they're being tested, whether those very nice words are being followed up with actions. And the number of companies are really moving in that direction. And I'm part of a dialogue with manufacturing companies in the World Economic Forum. And some of these companies are really doing it and really following up on those kinds of statements, but many of them aren't. And that's why you're seeing so much protest out there. And we're going to see more protests when companies say they are doing this, but it doesn't ring true with the reality of the workforce. We're going to see more and more people standing up and saying, we're not going to take this anymore. So we're not going back to the old normal, whatever that was. I believe we are in a world now, and we will be in a world where there's going to be negotiations, there's going to be change, there's going to be tension, there's going to be a lot of conflict. And it's all in how we manage that, both from a public policy standpoint, from a single organizational standpoint, and from a business community saying, let's start disciplining ourselves and start engaging all of these stakeholders, and we will come through this stronger as an economy and stronger as an individual business. That's where I think we are. Now, that requires all of us as educators to work with business and with other groups in civil society and with public policymakers to identify a course for building a new social compact or contract. And we think we've got some things to offer along those lines. And we have to be more proactive in sessions like this, going out to people across the world and saying, we can do this, but we've got to shift from an old mindset to a mindset that reflects the realities today. And I think we're going to make progress, but it's going to be bumpy. There's going to be a lot of work for mediators like me who are busy anyway. But lots of people are going to have to bridge these gaps, help people bridge gaps. I think that's one of the most important things we can do as professionals moving forward.
Thank you, John. Well, as always happens with these 30 minutes, we're almost out of time. But to me, and I think to everyone listening, that last statement both was a very encouraging and compelling vision for the future that we should be creating, and also a very practical admonition to all of us as leaders in our organizations and businesses, as well as obviously citizens and voters, wherever we may be, for something that we need to practically be doing to really make sure that the future is is better than otherwise it will be. So thank you very much. This has been very inspiring. So I'm watching the comments and the questions. There's been a lot of great feedback, many more than we could get to, but we'll find a way to answer many of those questions in a follow-up piece. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And it just remains for me also to remind everyone that our next webinar will actually be another very special kind of innovation for us. We were inviting in a non-faculty member from Sloan as a guest speaker, Patrick Sweeney, author of the book Using Fear as Fuel. That seems very timely in the throes of this COVID challenges as well. So once again, Professor Tom Kochan, thank you very much for this fascinating webinar and discussion. On behalf of everyone that's been listening, we're all, I think, inspired and motivated by hearing from you and hearing these ideas. Thank you all for joining us. Be safe, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.